So hello everyone, hello and welcome to this Workplace Wellbeing Ireland webinar. And we're coming to you in partnership with Irish Life Health and AJ Products. So I just want to kick off by thanking our partners because they've been a real constant support in what has been a turbulent year. So Irish Life Health, first of all, home of the My Life app. And I'd encourage you to check out the app because the app is actually freely available, whether you're an Irish Life Health customer or even if you're not. So check out the My Life app. A big shout out to AJ Products, our long-term partners. AJ are Ireland's leading provider of active at work ergonomic solutions. And I moved house very, very recently. So I'm actually excited, really excited to practice what I preach and finally get that sit-stand desk, that standing desk that AJ do so well. So I'm really looking forward to getting my sit-stand desk from AJ. So very excited to welcome our guest today, Dr. Jennifer Hynes. Jennifer and I have the really great privilege of delivering the postgraduate certificate in workplace wellness at Tangent in Trinity College in Dublin. And I was lucky enough to sit in on I sat in all of Jennifer's sessions, but one in particular that really stood out during our recent program, and that was one on stress and burnout. And now, as it turns out, in our recent Workplace Wellbeing Ireland survey, many members of the community highlighted stress and burnout as an area they really wanted to learn a little bit more on. So, who better really than Dr. Hynes to deliver on that? So, a quick introduction to Jennifer. Jennifer has years of experience lecturing in the areas of workplace wellness, human resource management, organizational behavior and economics at the Trinity Business School. She holds a PhD in organizational psychology and behavior, a Master of Education, a Master of International Economics, and if you don't mind, a Bachelor of Business Studies as well.
Studying loser.
And interests lie in the area of employee well-being, clearly, in particular stress, burnout, work engagement, psychological capital, workaholism, and employee motivation. So Jennifer, hello, and thank you for joining us on the webinar this afternoon.
Hello, thanks for having me. Lovely to be here in front of 100 people.
100 people. Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure to have you here. And like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed our session on stress and burnout. Really valuable as did the students during the program. So I know we'll get a lot of value from the session today. And the kind of the format is, I'm going to hand over to you in just a moment. So you'll kind of deliver like a presentation style session for about 20 minutes or so. If there's any questions that arise, I can jump in with some kind of relevant questions, as can the audience. I'll manage that from the audience. And then, towards the end, we'll have a kind of an open Q&A session. So that's kind of the format. I have some poll questions here, which I'm going to put to the audience. So if you're at your machine or your phone there, please do kind of jump in. You should be seeing those questions on your screen right now. First question is, what best describes your role? So it's nice to get an understanding of who's on the call. Question that kind of Jennifer and I were chatting about in advance, kind of to inform our session today. The next question is, are you joining this burnout and stress webinar from a personal perspective or from an organizational perspective or from both? And then finally, do you feel more stressed this year compared to previous years? So just give everyone just another moment or two to answer those questions. Declan, I see, is joining us from Brussels. Bonjour.
Good, Declan.
Francesca from Dublin, great to see. So I'm seeing all the, we're at 80% actually. So 80 people out of 100 have voted already. That's probably not coming up on your screen yet, Jennifer, but I'll share this.
No, I can see it actually. I'm interested and I'm looking at question number 3. So
yeah.
Do you feel more stressed this year? So far, 65% do.
Right. Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. So I'm going to share these results now in just one moment. I see 85% have voted, which is fantastic. So we'll give 10 more seconds there. We're at the 85%, 10 more seconds. If you want to get your vote in, cast your vote. Oh, look at this. Sure, we're almost at the 90% there. And there we go. That'll do it. So end polling. I'm just going to share these results on screen, so everyone should be able to see these now. So I think the HR professionals are the majority with 35%. I think a good kind of healthy mix there actually of senior leaders, well-being leaders, and you know, really good mix of roles represented. So it looks like, so I think both clearly winning out there in terms of kind of the perspective that people are joining for, which is great because I know you're actually going to look at both. Yeah, which is really good. And then, yeah, it looks like the majority are feeling more stressed this year compared to previous years. And 22% saying no difference. So interesting results. I know that's going to inform what you're going to be speaking about, Jennifer. So guys on the chat and the Q&A, please keep the comments, keep the questions coming. I'll go and moderate that now. I'll have a look in there now. And Jennifer, if there's an appropriate moment during your presentation, I'll jump in and ask some relevant questions. But over to you.
Okay, great. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thanks for joining in today, as Brian has already said. So I'm going to speak to you a bit about stress and burnout today. In terms of the topics that I'll look at, we've only got a limited amount of time, so I'll touch on what I can. We'll look at what is stress and how does it impact us. We'll look at when and how do people become burnt out. So we'll look at that difference between what is stress and what is burnout. We'll look at what can an organization do to reduce the likelihood of stress and burnout. And then we'll finish up on looking at, well, how can I actually help myself? So to begin with, I like to start with the definition. And I have two definitions to look at. One set are from an occupational health viewpoint, and then the other set are from a biological viewpoint. So the Health and Safety Executive within the UK have defined stress in terms of it's a harmful reaction, and it relates to undue pressures and demands that we face at work. And then the Health and Safety Authority of Ireland, when talking about work-related stress, which is what WRS stands for, they talk about how the person perceives the work environment. So we have that harmful reaction, we have the pressures and the demands, but then it's also really important how the person perceives that environment that they're working in. And when they actually feel that they have an inability to cope, that's when people become stressed from an occupational health viewpoint. So then in terms of biologically, and I won't get into it too much because it's not a biological lecture, but Hans Sale, if any of you are interested, is kind of the main writer in terms of stress. And he's defined it as a syndrome, okay? And it involves changes in the biological system, so changes within our body, and we'll look at some of those changes that we would experience. But what I think is really important here today is to discuss what are those external factors that actually, you know, impact us to create that stress. So we can be stressed by those that we interact with, so our colleagues or our managers, so people in our day-to-day life. The quality of basic necessities, that's another important one. So having shelter or conditions, you know, within our workplace. And then our body responds to this in a certain way. And we'll look at some of those responses based on GPs from Wales within the NHS. So we're looking at the biological state which happens as a result. I think this is a nice poster. I think most of us were here today because we've obviously experienced stress in some way, shape or form. I can say I've experienced pretty much every single one of them except the grinding teeth. I haven't noticed that one. But symptoms of stress are headaches, having low energy, and we'll look at that low energy and exhaustion today. Muscle pain, so musculoskeletal disorders, there's a correlation between stress and that. Stomach ache and stomach or acid reflux. Insomnia, so not being able to sleep, and we'll look at that because people ruminate, they're worrying, they're lying in bed, feeling quite distressed at night time, thinking about work or the next day ahead. Increased breathing. And this is interesting because when we look at the fight or flight that happens within our bodies, when we experience a stressful situation, a message goes up into our brain, to our amygdala, which is our emotional area in our brain. And it sets off this, these triggers and these processes which then lead to increased breathing and increased heart rate. And the body is amazing because that's our natural mechanism in dealing with stress. But the problem nowadays are that people are dealing with stress as they're sitting at a desk. You know, we're not in the wild, we're not in the jungle anymore, we're not running away from a lion or something. We're actually at a desk feeling stressed like this. So these are some of the symptoms of stress. So I think probably many of us will have had some or all of these. And I think it's really important then to look at the importance and what type of impact can stress have us in terms of, you know, our biological condition. So in terms of what places us at severe risk, there's a certain limit as to how far we can be pushed and our bodies can be pushed. And we're put in a very difficult situation when we're exposed to chronic stress and then our body starts to try to compensate in certain ways. And these are some of the outcomes of stress. And they've been demonstrated, you know, by many empirical studies. So unfortunately, it impacts our immune system. And when I think of COVID-19 right now, I think, wow, you know, our whole buffer against COVID-19 is our immune system. Then our other outcomes include suicide. So people become suicidal, or heart attack, or they have strokes. It also has been shown to be associated with greater and chronic inflammation. It also creates stress hormones, so cortisol and adrenaline. And I actually have a little study that I'm going to talk to you about today in relation to cortisol. It has correlations with type 2 diabetes, asthma, premature aging and death. These are all very glamorous. Anxiety, depression, high blood pressure. And then all of these things, you know, are what we'll call chronic diseases. And then just in terms of for the exchequer, for the government, for our health service, these are very expensive diseases to treat because they're life limiting and they're pretty permanent. And then in terms of, we'll look at later what impact these will have on an organization. So on the individual level, we know that we'll have all of these different biological outcomes, but there's also outcomes for the organization, because humans, we're emotional beings, we're working in groups together in offices. But when you have these kind of chronic illnesses or any of those issues that I mentioned on the previous slide, studies have found that stress causes long-term absence from work. It can alter people's behavior. It can change their relationships with others. It also has an impact in job performance. It can reduce a person's self-esteem as well. And then I think this one's really interesting, especially when you think of certain types of industries. It has an impact on creativity. People have an impaired memory. They're not able to make good decisions. And then they become irritable. So really those points demonstrate that it has an impact on the micro level, at the individual level, but also then at the meso level. So within teams, working within teams of people in close proximity to one another. And then also on the macro level for the organization in terms of their bottom line, you know, to be honest, your bottom line. I've included this diagram here from the job demand resources model. And you'll notice towards the left at the end, there's a strain circle, and you can see that there's a positive or a negative correlation between job performance and strain. So those who are exhausted, are feeling anxiety, or have health complaints in work, have lower levels of job performance. But also I think it's really important to look at the feedback loop there in terms of self-undermining. So they start to undermine themselves. And this is important because that erodes our personal resources and it erodes our ability to cope with the situations in work. So it's kind of almost like a lost spiral, which I'll talk to you a bit about when I talk about resources within work. So we can find ourselves almost digging a hole worse for ourselves, and it gets worse and worse and worse. So that's in terms of for the organization. I think it's really important to distinguish between pressure and stress as well, because we all have experienced pressure at some point in time. You know, everybody remembers back to the Leaving Cert, or, you know, luckily I've noticed in universities, exams are becoming less and less and less. but I remember feeling so stressed going into my master's in economics exams. Everything's on this one day. So we've all experienced pressure, but actually pressure to a point, if it's a challenge, actually can be quite positive because it can motivate us and it drives us to do things and achieve things. The problem is when that pressure becomes too much and we don't have that opportunity to recover. And by recover, think back to this biological perspective of humans. We need to have an opportunity to return to baseline levels where our glucose, our salt, all of these different things within our bodies have a chance to recover and recuperate so that we can start again. And when we don't have an opportunity to actually recover, and this kind of pressure is something that we feel that we cannot cope with, that's when we're running into issues with stress versus pressure. So that's the Health and Safety Executive. They have some very nice studies as well that you can look at within the UK. So then, why do people become stressed? I think this is another important issue to look at. So if we're going to talk about what can we do, it's very important to understand why people become stressed, and the complexity of humans as well really comes to the forefront here. So stress typically stems from mental or emotional pressure. And when we talk about emotional pressure, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, somebody's working as a nurse or a doctor and they face very difficult situations. It's more so when people feel that they don't have control over a certain situation. When I think of emotional pressure, I think of having to surface act, people who work in call centers, people who work in hospitality, people who are on the front line and actually don't get an opportunity to recover from the kind of pressures that they face in their jobs. Feeling like you're losing control, and I'll talk a bit about control and gain in the next slide. So there's some interesting points that I'll raise on that. Facing physical or verbal abuse, that can stress people out as well. And then facing hindrance, stressors and demands. So not something that's challenging that you feel that you can actually achieve and that you will feel good about yourself afterwards for. No, it's more so things that you feel like you don't have any control over, feeling like you have work overload, that you don't have enough time to complete the task. And we'll look as well later on in the presentation at our self-esteem and the critical role that that can play in terms of how we feel stressed. 2 points that are kind of connected here are leaders' psychological stress and abusive supervision. So studies have found that we are absolutely susceptible to contagion from others that we work with and crossover, and that our leaders can really have a significant impact on us in terms of distress. So their distress basically becomes our distress. And what's more is other research has shown that we're actually more impacted by those in close proximity to us. So if we interact very little with the CEO, but we're more likely to be impacted by our close manager, so maybe our supervisor or something like that, because they're in close proximity. The World Health Organization have some interesting information about stress as well at work, and they talk about the content of the job. So is the job monotonous, repetitive tasks, a boring job, lacking control? Feeling like you lack ability or knowledge or support within your job is very important as well. And this really demonstrates the social element of humans at work, because we look around and we see what others are doing and we see what other people have and how they're performing at work, and we judge ourselves based on that. So if we feel that we don't have the same abilities or knowledge as those we work with, that can have an impact on us in terms of stress. And then an ESRI study in 2018, they spoke about emotional demands, time pressure, and long working hours, and those elements having a stronger relationship with stress than other elements. So these are just some of the points. There are probably many, many more, but I can only obviously touch on so many. So I mentioned in the second point about this feeling of loss of control. And Hopful has done a lot of research on this, and then he teamed up with Lily as well. So what do we mean by control? So within life, there are certain objects that we we want to control or that we need in life. We're motivated to gain these kinds of resources, and we're motivated to control our ownership of these resources. So just some of the objects. Now, if you actually go into Hopfall's papers, he actually has a really good table of many, many, many different resources. So it very much so depends on the person. But typically humans are looking for things like, at the basic level, shelter, but then that can become quite competitive. Oh, I want a nicer house than my neighbor. I want to have a nicer car than my neighbor. Different conditions that we want in life. People want to have self-esteem, so our psychological needs in life. We want to have attachments, so friends, boyfriends, girlfriends, a good marriage. Some people want to have a certain seniority, so maybe they have a need for power or something along those lines within a job. Tenure, I think that's quite an important issue nowadays when we talk about the gig economy, and we have people on more and more fixed term contracts. So that really impacts them in terms of tenure. And I know that that's a big issue in higher education, but I'm sure it's an issue in other industries as well. And then health as well. Health is another important resource that we want, and that's our health, and then that's the health of those that we care about around us, and inner peace. And then obviously the basic ones such as money and social support. So you could actually look at these in terms of well-being. We're looking for physical well-being, social well-being, psychological well-being, and financial well-being. And when we fail to acquire these resources, and especially when we put in a lot of effort, that can really lead to what Hopfall calls a resource loss spiral. So we can become quite dangerous then when we will do anything to try to gain these kinds of resources. So our goal in life pretty much is to try to acquire these resources and protect them. And we can become stressed then when there's a failure in that. I think this study and this lens was very, very interesting from Dickerson and Kemeny in 2004. And they looked at the social self-preservation system. And I think that's really interesting when we think of how people work within organizations. So you'll notice in box number 1, it's about monitoring the environment for threats to social status or esteem. So as humans, we're motivated by and we feel good about ourselves when we have high levels of self-esteem and we feel that people respect us, almost thinking of ourselves almost as a brand. So what do we do as human beings? We scan the environment and we look for any threats. Okay, so this is our nature, to look for any threats. And then what we do is when we identify these threats, it makes us sound very rational. Actually, but you know, other studies will show that we're not so rational. So there's the economist in me. What do we do as a response to these threats that we identify? We have physiological responses, we have psychological responses, and we have behavioral responses. So on a psychological level, we might actually then start to feel doubt about ourselves and have negative evaluations about ourselves, and negative thoughts and negative emotions. But then on a physiological level, their study looked at cortisol. So cortisol is one of the stress hormones. So they found increased levels of cortisol within people when they perceived a threat to their social status. And then there were these physiological changes and behaviors that people do in response to this threat. Now, what was another thing that was interesting in their study is that not all stresses are the same. Okay, so some appear to be more dangerous in terms of cortisol. So the focus of their study was on cortisol, and they found that mental tasks, and ironically, as I'm doing it, public speaking and interviews actually produced greater cortisol responses. So higher levels of this stress hormone were produced in these kinds of situations where people felt they had to public speak or in an interview. So I'm sure we've all had that when we're going to an interview and we start to feel, you know, our heart racing or trying to catch your breath to try to just relax yourself. Now it becomes even worse. The cortisol response is even worse when we feel that the outcome of the performance was uncontrollable. So if we feel that we have to get up and have public speaking, or we have to attend an interview or some sort of mental task, and we feel that we didn't have control over that outcome, that then will have, again, another higher cortisol response. So we'll become even more stressed by that situation. And I've put here in the third box, uncontrollable context. So what types of things do we mean by uncontrollable context? So having an impossible task. So perhaps feeling like your manager has given you a task that's absolutely impossible and you're unable to do it. The time constraint is ridiculous. And then it's terrible, but it happens, getting false feedback on poor performance. So very Machiavellian management style, but it happens. Feeling harassed, auditory distraction. So actually I found this in my PhD research, that a lot of my participants were talking about not being able to actually focus on their job. They were just constantly being distracted. And they will be working on something that's quite a mental task, a high cognitive task. And then they're having knocks on the door, the emails are coming in, the phone is ringing, and it's very difficult then to focus, and people can become quite stressed in this situation. So basically emotionally distressing stimuli. And then people, when they feel that they have no behavioral method, there's nothing that they can do to try to fix how they're feeling. So they've total loss of control to avoid the stimuli. This will create this greater cortisol response, so the biological system. So I thought that was an interesting one in terms of the social self. And this is another one, and excuse the graphs, I'll briefly explain them. But I thought this was interesting because certainly for me, working in higher education, something we're constantly hearing are students have greater anxiety levels. There seems to be higher anxiety levels in society. Why are people feeling more anxious than they felt before? And this graph depicts that. And you actually can see that in both men and women, we have studies that show anxiety levels have been rising. They're rising here from the 1950s, and they end here. The study ended in the 1990s. So we know that anxiety scores have been rising, but then actually a group of researchers discovered that, hang on, this makes no sense because self-esteem is also rising. So if people's anxiety is rising and self-esteem is rising, what's actually happening? And I thought this was interesting that they were able to differentiate two different types of self-esteem. So there's the positive one, and we're trying to protect that, and we can become stressed when we feel that our self-esteem is being eroded. And this is the positive one, is happiness and confidence and being able to accept criticism and making friends and all of these things. But then there was the other group, the high self-esteem group, that have insecure high self-esteem. And I always think, I won't say it, I think of a political leader. We'll see if we can guess. So the insecure high self-esteem. So these type of people deny weakness. And the reason I'm talking about this, by the way, is imagine that this is a group of people that you potentially work with. That could be your manager, they could be a leader in your organization, they could be your colleague, they could be your subordinate. So they have a denial of weakness. They have a positive sense of themselves. They don't deal with threats to self-esteem very well. They can become violent. They can be racist. They're insensitive to others. They have a preoccupation with themselves. They react badly to criticism. So that would be very difficult if that's your subordinate and you're trying to do a performance appraisal with somebody who cannot accept criticism. Or likewise, if it's your leader, your manager, and they can't accept any criticism, the door is closed, they're not open to discussion. They're preoccupied with their image and appearance in the eyes of others, and they're very bad at personal relationships. So they've defined these people as narcissists, threatened egotism, or insecure high self-esteem. And I think that's interesting because this study found that actually it's this high self-esteem group that makes people anxious because they feel like they can't compete against this. And I think it's interesting as well that anxiety has been rising in the Western world. And I'm thinking here with my economics hat in terms of, you know, when you think of capitalism and you think of competition within a society and people are competing with each other for scarce resources. And that then can create quite a stressful environment in terms of trying to gain resources such as the nice car, the nice house, competing with your neighbors, and all of these things can create stress kind of within a society. So it's not just within the workplace, it's within the society, which brings me to this, it's like an Italian flag, a homage to Italy here. So some of the different kind of stress moderators and mediators that I've basically talked about here. So our stress levels can really be impacted by the culture that we live in. So based on those expectations and in the society and the level of competition in the society. So if you ever have read anything from Hofstede, and Hofstede categorizes countries in terms of masculinity and femininity, and Ireland is one of those countries that's considered quite masculine. And then to give a reference, Scandinavian countries would be considered quite feminine. And by masculine, we mean it's up to you, and it's a very competitive society, and the winner takes all. So therefore, that'll have an impact on the expectations. Your parents will have an influence in that, your school, your neighbors. But then also you as an individual are an internal driver of your own stress because of your motivations, your desires, your hopes and dreams. Then your job can also be a driver of this based on the job design or the resources within the job or the climate within the organization. And then I thought it was important as well to mention the economic drivers of stress, the cost of living. We're hearing about that, maybe not at the moment because of COVID. But before COVID, it was a hot topic, the cost of living in Dublin, the rents, the housing crisis, homelessness, and people feeling stressed, trying to make ends meet. They're going to work, but we don't know what's happening to somebody in their personal life, so they have all of these other stressors. So people are complex, and it's not, and I think even Brian, the poll showed that people are here for both. They're not just here for the organizational side of things. They're probably experiencing different stresses coming from all areas within their lives.
Very much so. It's like,
yeah.
I guess a lot of people might be here, representing an organization, so they're interested from that point of view. But of course, we're all at the human level, we're all interested in this as well.
And I think it's difficult as well. This idea, I really hate it. And I think, I'm happy to say, I think it's gone, leave your personal life at home, leave your personal life at store. I can't do that. That's an impossible task to ask someone to leave their life at home. Okay, I'll just cut off half of my life and I'll come in, and it's just not possible. People can't operate like that. So I think good organizations and successful organizations recognize that people are complex individuals and there could be lots of different things happening. And people remember the organizations or the managers that they worked under that were, I think, respectful of this and did things to try to help them or allowed them to flourish, I suppose, or even identified when somebody was having, an issue, that they were there to help them. So that's my crazy Italian looking circles for you to look at. So then moving on in terms of the three main groups of stress that you might have within an organization. So the HSA talk about three different types. So there's the stress from doing the job, there's the stress from the work relationships, and then there's the stress from the working conditions. So if you have kind of a monotonous job where you're doing the same things over and over again, I always think back, as a lecturer, I think of the types of studies and things we teach our first years in Trinity. And one of the first things they learn about is Frederick Taylor, and they learn about Taylorism and scientific management. And Taylor had people working in a factory and broke down their work piece by piece by piece, so that people would actually just perform, small operations. Very boring when I think of, joy within your job, or even Adam Smith talking about how, if you have a needle and you divide the roll up into somebody who creates the hole in the needle and the other person who makes the needle. Very, very boring, monotonous jobs. Another one is work overload. So we're not talking about having, you know, a project due in or something like that, or maybe if you're an accountant and it's coming to month end, it's not necessarily that. It's when it's consistently too many tasks for you to do, and then you don't have the time frame, so an insufficient time frame to actually be able to complete that. That's what causes people stress. And when you think of that in terms of control, that will impact the sense of control that people feel they have, because they're not actually able to complete the work and have a positive sense of self. Other issues in terms of relationship are poor teamwork, so not working well with others, complex hierarchies of authority, so feeling like you actually can't have any kind of direct communication with anyone. You know, Brian and I, when we worked on, we're working in tangent, and we were talking about workplace well-being programs, like one of the points that comes up consistently in the literature is this bi-directional relationship of communication. And complex hierarchies really, you know, they're the opposite of that, because it's very difficult to communicate up, and it just feels like all the information is just coming down, down and down, and you don't actually have a say then in the organization. Working in isolation, and I think probably many people maybe are feeling that at the moment, working from home and not feeling like you're part of a team. But there's things that managers can do and colleagues can do to improve that. And then feeling harassed and bullied at work. And another one as well is shift work. So, you know, you think of nurses, you think of doctors, you think of those working in transport. I doubt that we have many people who are working shifts here. The only experience I've had of shift work is when I was doing my degree. I worked in a nursing home, and I remember during the summer, they would put me on night shifts sometimes. So I was used to working days, and then they put me on the night shift. I felt like I was going insane walking home from work. I hadn't had any sleep. I felt like I was seeing and hearing things. So I have a lot of respect for people who work shift work, and then feeling threats of violence and aggression. Hopefully nobody is feeling that here today. So they're the three groups of stress. And then I said as well that I would talk about, well, what's the difference between stress and burnout? So this is in the light blue box, these are just some of the snippets of the definitions of stress that we've spoken about here today. So the changes in the biologic system, the pressure, and then the experience of the stress. Now, the difference between stress and burnout relates to the time. So burnout will be more chronic job stress. So it's prolonged job stress. So it's over a more extended period of time. And then its outcomes tend to be emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and diminished personal accomplishment. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that process here. So Freudenberger talks about how self-doubt starts to creep in. So we start to question ourselves. And then we start to feel fatigued. We start to feel tired at work. And then this overextension. So all of this effort because of the workload and the lack of resources and the incredible demands and potentially the poor relationships, and all of these things combine. And we start to become emotionally exhausted in the job. And probably at that stage, we're now thinking about leaving. I've probably had enough here. And then what happens is you start to become indifferent towards your job. So I don't care about this place, whatever. And I'm sure we've worked with people who have said, oh, whatever. You know, they've reached that point of indifference. And then they start to detach and become cynical. Now, the worrying thing is that, you know, stress is contagious to others. So if somebody's working in a team in close proximity with you and they're going through this, that can be quite difficult for those working around them. The final stage then is this low professional efficacy. So again, the burnout is just a chronic exposure to these stressors. So feeling like you're unable to achieve the workload or achieve what it is that's being set for you by your organization. So there, the Lee and Ashford quote is that our valued resources are lost. So any of those resources I spoke about. and then they're inadequate to meet demands, and they do not yield anticipated returns. So that's an interesting one that I'll speak about here. So Maslach and Leiter, Michael Leiter, actually got to see him speak at the European Work Psychology Conference, I think maybe about 4 years ago. But he's a really prominent burnout researcher. He's based in Canada. He's fascinating. Actually, I saw him twice. He spoke on RCSI as well. So he's fascinating. And him and his colleagues, they developed the 6 areas of work-life framework. And they say that a mismatch in any of these, a chronic mismatch in any of these 6 areas will actually lead to burnout. They can be the causes of burnout. So these 6 areas relate to workload. So again, having these demands that you're unable to meet, having a lack of control in your life, not feeling like you can change anything, that you're kind of, it's almost like you're on a steam train and there's nothing you can do about it. Rewards, I think this is interesting in terms of Segrist writes about effort reward imbalance. So in terms of your effort, are the rewards suitable that you've achieved? So when you put work into something, you have an idea of what the outcome will be. Have you actually achieved that outcome that you had hoped you would achieve? A sense of community. So these are the relationships with your colleagues, the relationships with your manager. So these are really important. A sense of fairness within the organization. So how does the organization distribute the resources that they have? How do they allocate their resources? We know that the resources are limited. They're not unlimited, but is there a sense of fairness, or is the manager just giving resources to people? Favoritism, you know? So is that happening? And then the person's individual sense of value. So I'm sure some of you will have heard of the psychological contract, or the person job fit, or the person environment fit. We all have our own, you know, philosophical viewpoints and our own values in life and our morals. And when we join an organization, we enter there with hopes and dreams. And if there's a mismatch between our values and the values of the organization, that can then lead to burnout as well, because we start to depersonalize and feel exhausted. And, you know, as humans, we try to fix the problems as well. So we put in a lot of effort trying to address the problem. And then if we don't see any positive outcomes, that's exhausting, and people become cynical as well there. I put in a little point here from an ESRI study as well, just to give you an idea of how's job stress in Ireland. Now, the last one was from, the last data point they collected was from 2015, but it doubled from 8% in 2010 to 17% in 2015. Studies are coming out constantly now this year in terms of distress and stress and COVID-19. People are more stressed. Studies have found women are more stressed than men. There are different reasons behind that, but people in general are feeling more stressed this year. And I think that's understandable when we think of, you know, people are working from home. They have a fear of loss of resources in terms of their own health, their family's health. Maybe they're juggling childcare as well at home. You know, they all of a sudden they have to become the IT help desk at home. They're everything, and they're working from home, and people are also working longer hours now. And there's not that sense of recovery or a break where you can say, I'm going to go away for a long weekend, I'm going on a holiday. Right now we're stuck within 5-kilometer radius. So, you know, holiday is not exactly an option. So people are feeling stressed, and I suppose the methods to try to alleviate that, they're quite limited at the moment because of restrictions. So then my final 2 slides, so this one looks at what can an organization do to reduce the likelihood of stress and burnout, and then the next one will look at what can I do. So in terms of what an organization can do, they can have a look at the resources and demands within their organization and assess, okay, what demands are we placing on our employees? Are they a challenge or are they a hindrance? And by a hindrance, I mean red tape, excessive administration, excessive hierarchies, poor relationships between staff members. These are the types of things that are a hindrance, and they don't They don't foster a sense of achievement. They foster a sense of a lack of control. And what type of resources are we providing our staff? Do they have access to resources? Do they have access to an EAP? Have we provided them, just in terms of the basic things, the ergonomics, have we assessed the ergonomics of working from home? You know, have they got the right equipment to work from home? When you're working in an organization, you know, you'll have an assessment of your desk area. Nobody's doing assessments of desk areas at home. Some people are working on, you know, kitchen tables. So these kinds of resources. Then the organizational climate. So having a look at the type of climate, and it's important to distinguish between climate and culture. So the culture is the soul at the higher level, the vision and the mission. But the climate is that more so at the team level. What are the climates within our teams? And that very much so relates to point number 4 here of voice and psychological safety and trust. Do we have an organization where people can speak up? Do we have an organization where people can challenge the status quo? Do we have an organization where people feel safe to voice their concerns? Do we have an organization that fosters learning from mistakes, that it's okay to make mistakes, and that if we do, we won't make a show of someone, we'll actually learn from that. And Amy Edmondson is a researcher in Harvard Business School. She's done a lot of research on this in terms of nurses, doctors, and other organizations as well, where it's really critical that people speak up if a mistake has been made. But do we create that kind of an organization where it's an open communication, and that people feel a sense of an ability to speak up? Do we create an organization that actually fosters work engagement? So by work engagement, I mean vigor and dedication, or are we the opposite? Because burnout and engagement are said to be the opposite of each other. Or are we the type of organization that creates emotional exhaustion? Do we create an environment which promotes cynicism and depersonalization? Or are we the opposite? Do we provide those kinds of resources which bolster work engagement and motivation in work? And then do we have an environment that creates positive relationships, and do we offer social support to our employees? So, you know, that very much so relates back to the type of managers and the policies of managers there. Do employees feel that they can speak to their managers? Are their managers there for them? Is it an open door policy? So lots of research has shown that emotionally intelligent managers are better managers. So those with empathy, those that recognize the concerns that their employees have. And then other research as well has shown that managers that can recognize that they're not perfect at everything, you know, that they also make mistakes. That as well, you know, can really foster a positive sense of, you know, social support within an organization. What they can also do as well is establish metrics. There's no point just, you know, doing something in the dark. You may think you have a problem, but until you've identified what specifically the problem is, there's no point in implementing or running any kind of program. So I would say that it's really important to establish your metrics. So identify firstly, do we have a stress and burnout problem? And if so, it's very important then to identify, well, what are the drivers? What are the antecedents of those stress issues that we've identified in our study?
If I could just jump in there, one of the questions we've received is, how would an organization go about measuring stress and burnout?
Yeah. So I would say, you know, go about it in a very scientific method. Okay. So research has shown that organizations, as much as they're trying to measure, they can often get it wrong. So it's really important to identify the types of tools that you're going to use to measure the stress and to measure the burnout. So for example, if you wanted to measure burnout, Maslach and Leiter have a Maslach burnout inventory general scale. And that's a tool that you can use to identify those 3 elements of burnout. But there are lots of different tools that you can use to measure stress and to measure measure burnout. One of the things when you're doing a PhD, it's absolutely hammered into you, you know, your model and why are you building a model like this, and is there theoretical and empirical support behind why you've come up with a hypothesis such as our employees are stressed because of X or Y. So we need to, you know, within organizations, you need to firstly identify, are they stressed? Are they burnt out? You need to identify what are those drivers of that stress and burnout. And it may be that some are more prominent drivers, so they have a greater correlation with stress and burnout than other things, you know. So it could be, you might also want to identify within teams, you might notice that one team is more stressed than another team. And that's interesting because, well, what's happening? Is it something to do with a team member? Is it something to do with a manager? Is it something to do with the workload within that team? So there's lots of different variables that you could use to test it. So first, I think it's important to identify, are they stressed or are they burnt out? Then that also comes into another decision. Well, do we want to go down the quantitative survey road, you know, where we send out a survey to all our staff? Or do we want to go down the qualitative road where we're actually going to interview people or we're going to do focus groups? Now, the problem with that is, you know, I know most of the people here on your poll are HR professionals. Now, I can safely say that I wouldn't, and I think probably 100% of people would say they wouldn't tell the truth if their HR manager was asking them about, you know, to be honest about stress in the company, because that person has control over your performance appraisal, your remuneration, your chances at growing within the company. It's a very dangerous question to ask someone. So, you know, you're seeking the truth. You want a challenging voice. You want people to speak up and tell you what's happening. But, you know, in that sense, it's better sometimes to get out, you know, to get outsiders in, that people can feel safe to discuss these types of concerns. And then a thing that can happen then is that those interviews or those focus groups, that data can be collated on a more aggregate level so that nobody can be identified. You know, you can't say, oh, that's John in the finance department causing trouble again. Yep. You know, this kind of, you want people to be able to speak up and be open. And that's if you really are serious about trying to identify what the problem is. And another thing as well in terms of metrics is, you know, you can design these questions and ask, you know, are you very happy, or somewhat happy? Yes or no? And, you know, you don't really have an option to say, I'm not happy at all. Or, you know, it's better to use a scale, you know, 1 to 5. You know, there's these tricks of the trade that are absolutely hammered into you when you're doing a PhD. And they're things that, you know, maybe more larger organizations have the resources in terms of data analytics staff. But if you're a smaller organization, you may not have that. You may not realize
that it's an important point. It's important that as if you're a HR leader or a wellbeing leader, don't be intimidated by all of this. You do not need to be a data analytics expert.
No.
If you're in a larger organization, you possibly have some resources there that could support you. Yeah. If not, it's probably best to go external.
And I think that is a nice point, which goes back to these types of managers. If you're a manager that leads with humility, you recognize that, look, these are my core skills. I can't be excellent at everything. And people don't respect somebody who thinks they're excellent at everything. They're potentially that type 2 self-esteem narcissist that thinks that they're excellent at everything. People have more respect for someone who recognizes and acknowledges, look, this isn't my forte, but actually I'd love to get your feedback on this. And there's no shame in getting, you know, outsourcing something to someone or hiring someone, identifying, look, we have a skills gap here in our organization and we can bring somebody in to do this. And data analytics is really only kind of, it's been more prominent the last few years because of springboard programs, you know, or HR metrics. That's becoming more and more prominent. But you can't be expected to be a master of everything.
No,
you're going to end up a jack of all trades. That's what will happen.
We might mention that briefly again before we finish up. But it's a couple of minutes to the hour.
Whoa, sorry. Whoa.
No, time flies when you're having fun. This has been really incredibly informative.
I'm actually really sorry I didn't
slide on the individual. Obviously, we could have been here for a couple of hours. It's been powerful. I mean, I particularly enjoy, like, it's fascinating the fact that Ireland is a masculine society. That kind of makes a lot of sense. And then the Scandinavians being feminine. Stress is contagious. Those 6 areas of work life were really interesting as well. So I'll hand over. Do you want to finish off with your last slide?
Yeah. I'll just skip that last one about the well-being, and I'll just go here. This is the final slide anyway. What can I do to reduce my stress? So I pulled these from different empirical studies. So there have been studies done to show there is evidence that that these strategies work in terms of reducing your stress. So recovery, relaxation, and meditation. So even studies in the UMass Hospital in Boston, they found that those who had high blood pressure and those who were taking high blood pressure medication, that actually when they implemented relaxation techniques, they were able, after the second wave of the study, they were able to reduce one medication for 50% of the cohort. So I think that's a positive finding. Replenishing your resources and taking a break, giving your body a chance to return to those baseline levels, that's really important. Exercise and good diet, you're the master at this, Brian, in terms of exercise and the importance of that. Sleep. Having sleep will impact you in terms of making better decisions as well within work. Having that psychological detachment and avoiding ruminating. So you could have a look at any of these studies that I've put in here. And I think that that's an important one. The psychological detachment and avoiding ruminating is going to impact your sleep. If you're going into work and you haven't had any sleep and you're constantly thinking about work, you've no break as a person. These ones are interesting as well. Resilience building. So we can build our resilience. And this is important because, Brian and I could work in the same organization and I could be very stressed and Brian might not be. And this could actually very much so relate to our resilience. So it's kind of a buffer that individuals have. But actually you can build your resilience. Then there's this idea of PsychCap, which looks at our optimism, cynicism and hope and all of these things. And studies have, focused on learned helplessness. And I was mentioning this to Brian, the internal locus of control. So some people very much so feel like they don't have any power over their own destiny or their own lives. Versus people who feel like, well, I actually do have power and there's something I can do about this. So if you kind of lie down and say, oh, that's it, they've got me, versus, no, that's it, I'm absolutely saying no, and I'm going to do something about this now. And then in terms of the job, and this is something I have spoke about in my PhD, this idea of job crafting. So altering your job to suit you in some way. So it can be cognitively or behaviorally. So how you perceive the job, a shift in how you perceive certain parts and focusing on the good parts of your job. And then adjusting your behavior towards your job, recognizing that you can behave differently towards the different demands in your job and the different resources in your job. So you can adjust yourself cognitively or behaviorally in your job. And all of these things, I think, as well, relate back to well-being. So the social, the physical, the psychological, and the financial side of well-being. I'm so sorry that I went over.
Absolutely fine.
I'm so sorry.
The comments are flowing in there, really, really positive. Your time flies when you're engaged, I think was one.
Yeah.
Like you yourself were fully engaged there. So, I think we could have had a separate webinar on that last slide alone. So we'll definitely do something again. Maybe even the podcast we might do something. Just a couple of thank yous. There's a lot of questions came in there, so I might send some of the questions to you, Jennifer, and we might reply to them individually.
Yeah.
We might do that. I'll be sending a recording of the session to everyone that registered. You know, big thank you to our partners, Irish Life Health, to AJ Products. Interesting enough, Jennifer, and there was a question about this as well. It came in from Neve about where do you establish a baseline? Where do you start? And as you've kind of been touching on, myself and yourself, we've been interested in this. I do get quite a few requests in this area, and I am not a data analytics person. I can give you a very basic kind of, you know, survey monkey style survey, but when it comes to the deep analytics, you know, really understanding the questions and the scales, that really is your area of expertise. So really looking forward to partnering with you on. We've kind of put a lot of work into this kind of well-being baseline, if you like, that we're looking at. If anyone is interested, anyone watching in that's interested in learning more about maybe getting a well-being baseline for your organization, let us know, and we can send you on the PDF that we have, a 2-page PDF, because I think it is a bit of a gap. It's, you know, I don't really see, there's plenty of surveys out there, survey tools. You know, you can go with a provider to give you the overall kind of pulse survey style format, if you like, but I don't see any kind of specific well-being baseline and something that can be tailored to your organization if it does happen to be an issue with stress or burnout that you're looking to really understand what those drivers are. So really looking forward to developing that even further with you, Jenny. And thanks so much for your time today. That was absolutely invaluable. And I know I'll certainly be looking at the replay again, and I'm sure many others will too.
I'm sorry, I really didn't realize I'd gone so far over, and I probably overloaded people. But yeah, feel free to watch back, and yeah, absolutely, like, you know, you're going to send me on the questions, and yeah, get in touch if you have questions.
The positive comments have really been flowing in. So listen, Jenny, thanks so much again for your time.
No problem.
For anyone that wants a, you know, a deeper dive in the overall area of workplace well-being, this program is now live. It's kind of an 8-step framework for developing, delivering and sustaining a well-being program in your workplace. You can go to workwellinstitute.org to find out more about that. And yeah, just thanks so much. Drop myself a line, drop Jenny a line if you'd like any further details on anything we've discussed, and you're very welcome to join the LinkedIn community as well. So thanks everyone. Thanks so much, Jenny. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.